Great. So let me welcome everyone. We are so glad that you chose to spend part of this lovely Sunday afternoon with us. We have a great program in store for you. We ask you to please keep your mics muted during Jürgen's presentation and to direct your questions to me in the chat box. We will share those with Jürgen during the Q&A portion of our program in a little while. I'd like to give a special thanks to my colleague, Holly Nelson. She's giving us a big technical assist today. Please bear with us as we try to share some video clips with you. We hope it will go smoothly, but bear with us and just be patient if we have a little bit of a technical glitch. It's a little tricky to organize everything with the screen share, but I think it'll be just fine. If you're interested in watching Patton again, or for the first time, the library does have a really good 2-disc DVD set of the film. I spent some time yesterday watching the second disc, which has a lot of extra material, including a really terrific documentary on the making of the film with interviews and a lot of information about the production, the screenplay, the cinematography, the locations in Spain, and much more. It's really fascinating. It was clearly a major feat to get this movie produced, and it still holds up so well after 50 years, I have to say. And yes, this is the 50th anniversary of the film, winning 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, and of course, Best Actor for George C. Scott, which he famously refused to accept. Jürgen Kalwa has lived and worked in New York and West Cornwall since 1989 as a freelance journalist. He reports on American culture and sports, and these reports appear on German public radio and in various newspapers, including the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung and the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. He has also authored a number of books of nonfiction, including biographies of Tiger Woods and Dirk Nowitzki, and an examination of the Lance Armstrong scandal. He has also narrated German language audiobooks. He lives right here in Sharon, and he's going to explain to us in a little while why that's significant to this story. If, you know, in pre-pandemic times, we would all be together in the beautiful library right now, and maybe possibly we'd be watching the whole movie together. We obviously can't do that. So to start, we're going to show a little appetizer from the film Patton.
You seated? I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. And then all this stuff you've heard about America not wanting to fight, wanting to stay out of the war, is a lot of horse dung. Admired the champion marble shooter, the fastest runner, big league ball players, the toughest boxers. Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war, because the very thought of losing is hateful to America.
So now we see all the good faces out there.
Yes.
So we start, we talk. Okay.
Great.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and allowing me to talk a little bit about how history, which in this case is military history, and the history of making movies, and the little individual history that we all have, our own in our own lives, how they sometimes intersect in a very fascinating way. And the reason why I wanted to call this The Road to Patton is because the title itself is actually more than just a simple piece of information. So we have one road to Patton, which is West Cornwall Road in Sharon, on the Sharon side of the river. We get our mail in West Cornwall, so our postal address is West Cornwall, but that's a different story. And this is where my dive into the history of the movie began, because I discovered something many years ago that the movie had something to do with the house that my wife and I own. And so I always wanted to find out more about it. But it took me some years. So this 50th anniversary this year became the peg for the story that I did for German Public Radio, which aired just 10 days ago, about more about the movie and how it came about. I still could not introduce the German audience with my personal story, which I find even more fascinating than the other parts, because that's the most interesting element of it, I think. So my house in the 60s was owned by somebody else, rented out to this wonderful, colorful person named Ladislas Farago. He lived in New York, but he used this house as a retreat to write this 800-page book or tome. So if you want to know, this is the title. This is how big it is. This is from the first edition. I was able to, in the old days, before Amazon allowed you to buy used books, it took me almost a year to get the copy, but I needed to bring it to the house. It was basically a certain rite of passage to finish, the circle. The book that was written in this house came back to this house some decades later. But that was basically, that phase. I don't know about you, but when you find out about something like that years after it has happened, it feels a little like finding gold or oil on your property. Just the difference is it's more sentimental and not really commercial. So in a way, it's similar to the stone walls that some of us have on our grounds. That they also give you certain information about the past, and so they themselves are not really very valuable commercially, but they give you an idea and an image of things from the past. So you can start like I did. There have been other writers with local connections. Here in Cornwall, we think of James Thurber. In Lakeville, people think of George Simenon, who wrote the detective series Maigret. But I bet you that none of these writers you can think of was as colorful as Ladislas Farago. So I would like to use this opportunity to introduce you to a person you might have never heard of. So we can do that, I find, in a most fascinating way by taking a snippet from YouTube, from the television show To Tell the Truth, 1957, where a panel of celebrities had to figure out who of the three candidates was the real Ladislas Farago. So this was before he wrote Patton, by the way. And this is what the moderator told the audience, and Holly wants to share her screen now and allow this for all of you to see.
Photostatic copy of an affidavit. Will you please listen and follow along as I read it? I, Ladislas Fargo, am an authority on international intelligence and espionage, and have written 13 books on this and allied subjects. As a foreign correspondent, I had several interviews with Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. I flew in Hitler's private plane, rode with Mussolini in his special armored train, and for my work during the Ethiopian crisis, I was decorated by Emperor Haile Selassie. Although during my youth I became involved in a duel with sabers, I managed to keep my skin intact until I was wounded while covering the Spanish Civil War. During World War II, I spent 4 years in Washington, D.C. as Director of Research and Planning for the Special Warfare Branch of the United States Office of Naval Intelligence. In this connection, I was directly involved in the writing of the text of the Potsdam Declaration. I swear that the above statement is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Signed, Ladislas Fargo.
So, thank you, Holly.
You're welcome.
So, number one, the pronunciation of a Hungarian name, that's a thing in itself. So he was called Fargo by this gentleman, but he didn't object. It was, and the panel hardly figured it out. It was the gentleman on the left with the glasses. That's, the gentleman at the age of, I don't know, I have to do the math, about 40 something or early 50s in 1957. And here is a next snippet about this Hungarian-born journalist. It's a recording from a press conference he gave in June 1972 about another famous object of intrigue, and that was a gentleman named Martin Bormann, a right-hand man of Adolf Hitler, who historians weren't sure if he had been killed, if he had killed himself, or if he was living like guys like Eichmann in Argentina. He claimed he lived in Argentina. Holly?
What I am trying to prove that I'm in the possession of official documents from at least 3 South American governments, which unequivocally state that Martin Bormann had entered South America in 1948, that he lived in Argentina unmolested till 1955. It is picked up by other governments, documents from other governments, namely by the Chilean and Peruvian governments, following his footsteps until 1960. Then he returned to Argentina from time to time. And then again, I have the Argentine documents. I have the documents to prove it. The documents are authentic. I accept both the authenticity and the contention of the documents, but that is how far I am willing to go.
Thank you, Holly, for this video snippet. I hope everybody could hear the sound, because you can hear his accent.
Chief prosecutor,
And a general.
that he will instruct.
Okay,
Yeah.
no, I'm talking over it.
That's okay. He's gone now, I hope.
Okay, so here's a gentleman who he learned German in Hungary, because Hungary was the Austrian-Hungarian phase in European history. So he learned German in school. He was able to move on. After the Nazis took over, he had to leave Berlin, just like many concerned people. And he moved to England, where he learned English. He only learned English late in life, so you can hear his accent. Now, I could not verify his claims that he, the Hungarian Jew, that he interviewed Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. And when I talked to his son, John, who lives in New York, he could not give us any confirmation of that either. But the Bormann claims from the early 70s, they turned out to be completely bogus. So, this man knew how to find, how to sleuth and find fascinating topics, but he not always was on the correct, didn't give us the correct information. But something else I was able to fact check, which is, to me, is even more fascinating, that after the Nazis took power and he went to England, he started to write books. And one of his early books is about Palestine, the original title, Palestine on the Eve. And this book about his trip to, the British Mandate, Palestine, is mentioned in the diary of, as we say, Anne Frank, or as you might say, Anne Frank. She writes in one of her last entries that she wants to read this book before she is being found in Amsterdam and then transported to the death camp in Germany, where she dies in 1945. So another example of how this man, who then ended up in my house, was in quite a few people's, he was relevant to a certain extent. Now, the Patton book, was largely based on an unusual but solid source. So you can't really blame him on anything. He was very solid. And how did that happen? He made a connection to a person who was Patton's assistant during the war. And Patton dictated a diary to this non-commissioned officer. A diary that was on thin, there were copies made, carbon copies made on very thin paper, but all of this paper traveled through the war years, Italy, France, Germany, and back to the United States. And this assistant kept his copy, and he didn't divulge that he had it. So Farrago was able to find out about this. We don't know all the details, but he was in possession of these thousands of pages of Patton's unpublished diary. So that was the value of his real approach to Patton's life, because this guy had become a famous general. He died in 1945 and after the war after a car accident in Germany. And then the family, who was never interested in having people without their control write anything about this, they got wind of it and they sued him in federal court based on copyright claims. So while he was here writing the book, he also had to go to Boston to federal court, and his then 12-year-old son, was a part of the trip, made the trip with him and remembered what he saw in the courtroom. Of course, when you're that young, you don't remember all the details. The New York Times wrote about this, and also about the fact that they settled, which ended up meaning Farrago took anything out that sounded like a verbatim quotation from the source material. But of course, I mean, if you've ever read something like this, you can phrase it in your own language. It's not like, he didn't have to shut up. He didn't have to not divulge anything. So the book, Patton, Ordeal, and Triumph, is basically a very strong window into the mind of Patton. The Road to Patton, Part 2, the background story of how the movie became a reality. So 50 years ago, as Gretchen mentioned, the movie was triumphant at the Oscars. 7 awards, one of whom came with an interesting footnote, which was George C. Scott rejected it as the first actor in the history of Hollywood to do that. And he still stands out, even 50 years later, as the man who redefined the biopic genre. That's not just my opinion, but it's supported by quite a few people who have studied film and the history of film. George C. Scott is the one, he took an egotistical narcissist with all his true life character flaws and his military genius, and turned him into a larger than life figure. He became Patton. And no other than Patton's daughter-in-law, Joanne, told me this in my interview with her and her daughter, Helen, who is in the Patton legacy business over in Europe, because she remembers vividly how she and her husband, George S. Patton, another general in the line of Patton generals, were sneaking into a movie theater in 1970 in New York. And they wanted to see the movie because they couldn't stop it from happening, but they saw the movie. And what did the son say when he was watching the movie? Even though George C. Scott has a slightly different face and his voice sounds different, it's deeper. The general had a higher voice and didn't really like his own voice. It sounded not very manly, but George C. Scott brings his dimension to all of this. And so the son, George Patton, says to his wife, he's got it. You know, even though he recognizes the differences, but he also feels it is the quintessential portrayal of his own father, which you know, I was able to hear from her, Joanne Patton, who lives down in Darien, by the way. And the George C. Scott and the Patton family developed their own personal friendship. You know, I can go into more stories about that, but maybe that's a little bit too long here. If you want to know more about what it took, you know, this road to get the movie made, I would like to recommend you a separate book. It's called Making Patton, and it was written by the military historian Nicholas Sarantakis, who is a professor at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and whom I also interviewed for my radio documentary earlier this year. He had access to the archives of, here's another name, Frank McCarthy, who was the producer and who is way behind the scenes, the most important person in all of this. McCarthy was an officer in World War II. He worked with Marshall, General Marshall. And after the war, he went to Hollywood and he produced a few movies. And he, almost from the get-go, he tried to produce a Patton movie, beginning in the early 50s. But only when Ladislas Farago's book showed up, you know, in the publishing world or in the published arena, he realized that he now has something that he can really work with. And he paid Farago $75,000 for the movie rights, which in today's money is about $500,000. So it was considered to be a very valuable piece. And Frank McCarthy is also the one who was courageous enough to have a young, completely untested Francis Ford Coppola to write the script. This guy, Coppola, who later made the Godfather trilogy and a war movie, Apocalypse Now. And it was this script that George C. Scott fell in love with after he was asked to play the role, but he wasn't even the first choice. Other actors were considered. Now, get your, you know, fantasy going. Imagine John Wayne, who was the first actor to be considered in this role. I can't, because I only know John Wayne. He can only play one person, and that's John Wayne. I don't think he could play somebody of that renown. Burt Lancaster was another person who was considered, but it didn't work out. And then Rod Steiger came into play, and he didn't have the time to do it. And he recommended, that's, you know, how far I can tell this story, he recommended to get in touch with George C. Scott, which was masterful. And the director, Franklin Schaffner, was picked also by McCarthy, and you wouldn't call him, you know, a great director, but a very masterful manager of massive productions. And it was massive. I mean, they had so many locations to work with. They had weather issues they had to work with. They wanted snow. They needed snow for certain scenes. It was all difficult. And they had the Spanish army to help them because they couldn't get any support from the Pentagon. So the Spaniards had old American tanks and planes, stuff like that. So if you want to know more about how all of this came out, Making Patton, that's the book you also should pick up. And if you want to hear me now a little bit how I fit into this picture, you know, why am I the person who wants, you know, or who did the documentary in my own ways and is now interested in talking about this? I think it's, you know, it's the case of somebody who, of course, is a journalist, is a post-war German, has been battling with this legacy of German history, trying to figure out, you know, what happened before I was born. There's elements of family history, which starts with, you know, my father's family being kicked out of a formerly Eastern German part called East Prussia. My mom's house was flattened by a British bomb in 1945. And how these two people meet is actually also another funny story, typical post-war German story. So I grow up with questions. And so one of the ways to deal with questions is to go pursue answers, which in many cases I've done. So quite a few of my topics have dealt with, for instance, surviving Jews. I talked to somebody who worked in the Dutch resistance for a different story. I once interviewed somebody who was a top military police security guy for General MacArthur in Brisbane in Australia. And then there is this other example that I bumped into a local gentleman at an event of the Hotchkiss Library of Sharon who wanted to tell his story. He was a former Air Force, German Air Force person, and he wanted to have his memoirs captured, which I helped him write. So, you know, all of this happens sometimes in the direct vicinity. And so then Ladislas Fargo, you know, comes my way. And let me finish this little presentation by telling you the punchline. How did I find out about Ladislas Fargo? Well, we had some work done by a landscaper from Cornwall Bridge. And after he was done and we chatted a little, he told me, well, he had been to this house before and he remembered it not so pleasantly because he had done snow plowing in the early 60s. And at some point he wanted to get paid for his services, but the person who had hired him, Ladislas Fargo, was already gone. So he was, not being paid. And he knew a few more things about this guy. And I was able to talk to a lady who had owned this house. She was still around. And she was the one who told me about the Patton connection. And she had a copy of the book. So, she showed it to me and I thought, well, that is special. Who has, things like this not in your personal past, but in the past of your path. I mean, you suddenly realize you're connected to bigger things and you want to explore those, which I've done now. And so I'm in a much better shape to tell people about it. And I hope this will give you some idea of how people like me, journalists who live around here and work for foreign entities, what they do and what they're, what they're up to. So if you have questions or if you want to know more, please go ahead. I hope this was not too long as an introduction.
You can put your questions in the chat box. I have a couple I can ask till we get some from the audience, but I'm wondering how the movie was received in Germany, and also if you've had any feedback to your radio piece that was recently on in Germany.
No, the radio piece didn't produce much, and that's common with traditional media. You hardly ever get feedback, and if so, maybe somebody who knows much more than you and is much smarter than you will tell you that you made a mistake. So you can hope that because you don't hear anything that you didn't make a mistake. So and the reception of the movie, I mean, it was good, but the Germans have a traditional way of dealing with American or foreign movies, which I don't like, but I like to mention that. So they completely dub these movies. Now imagine you have seen George C. Scott, right? And I have raved about his performance. Now imagine a German voice pretending to be George C. Scott, pretending to be George S. Patton. I mean, it works on a cerebral level, but it doesn't work on an artistic level. But the Germans are just jaded. They don't know any better. I mean, other than the ones, who have learned languages like I've done. And in the 70s, it got a little better, but in Germany, we still stick to this way of, dubbing these movies. And so you would not discover this guy's work. I mean, it's like just to see him, and then you have an actor in Germany who also dubs John Wayne, what is this? So let's say, yeah, they got the movie, they understood the movie, and but not on an artistic level. So
And what is Patton's legacy today? Do you think here and I'm talking about the man, the real general,
yes.
here and in Europe?
Well, I think the movie gave us something, and of course that starts with the book, Ladislas Farrago's book. The movie gave us something that all the, I mean, in the history of telling history, we have all these weird ways to like all these kings and monarchs and generals and all these, religious leaders, presidents, whatever, and we bow to all of them. And we have a very simple understanding of how they came to their tradition, or how they became an important part of history. And so here we get a very nuanced picture, and I think something like this will live with us and will sustain itself, because it's not just, great guy. And of course he was a military genius, mainly because he was a maniac also. I mean, he was putting himself out there himself. I mean, he was at the front lines himself. That's not made up, that's it's not like Ivanhoe or other stories we've seen in the movies. But I think I can add this one flavor. So he was politically, he was a weirdo. So in a way, when he was charged in Bavaria after the war to make sure that all the Nazis are, at least disgraced, taken out, I don't know, even sent to prison or whatever, he was interested in keeping them around and rebuilding, the German whatever. And that was a reason why he was basically taken off of that position and put into a position of no real effect. And then he really wanted to keep on fighting against the Soviet Union. You can argue that that might have been smart in terms of whatever military goals they would have come up with, but it was totally strange. And in a way, he probably enforced some of the reaction on the Soviet part, being concerned about how American or the United States would ramp up. And when you look at the post-war European map, you can see basically NATO as an circling the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc from Norway all the way to Turkey, so that that planes like the U-2 could be sent a straight line, beeline from one part, from Turkey to Norway or something, in order to keep the Soviet Union in check. So Patton is, it has to be considered a very difficult character, but that doesn't change the appreciation about what his real value is. He helped, as he said, in this speech, he helped to kill Nazis, and that was important. I mean, I say that as a German. I was liberated by people like him, or I wasn't born yet, but people like me were liberated by the Americans. And so here's a late thank you to all of you and your parents who helped to do that. I feel very strongly like that.
Do you think it's a pro-war movie or an anti-war movie? I know critics are sort of split on that, and it's really astonishing that it won Best Picture in 1970, right? And even Oliver Stone goes so far, I think I saw somewhere, as to say that Nixon, it's true, was a big fan of this movie, and Oliver Stone actually believes that it encouraged Nixon, to invade Cambodia.
Yeah. No, Nixon seems to have loved Patton. I mean, Donald Trump, I don't know if you remember in 2017, when he introduced General Mattis as his defense secretary, he compared him to Patton. I'm sure Trump had no idea what he was talking about, but that's another story. So there were people. Ronald Reagan famously wrote a letter to Frank McCarthy. He was, I think, governor at the time. So you have those people who really like military and who like the portrayal of Patton in this movie as a pro-military thing. But then you also have the people who notice the nuances, there's this scene in in the field hospital where he slaps a soldier, which is a true event. I mean, it was condensed in the movie from two different events. He did it twice into one. And it almost cost him his career because this made headlines in the United States, and the general public was, pro-war, but they were not, kicking poor soldiers, drafted soldiers into the behind and being, forced to suffer through traumatic experiences. And so people have been picking on that too, and they saw all of that in the movie too. So that's why Nicholas Sarantakis, the historian I mentioned who wrote the book Making Patton, when I talked to him, he told me this movie is almost like a Rorschach test. So you learn more about the people who say, pro-war, or the people who say anti-war or anti-military. Then you learn about the movie because it offers both, sensibilities, quite a bit of fodder. And part of it, I think, that's the genius of the script, that how the film ends. The film doesn't end with the death of Patton. It ends with a very contemplative part where Patton is in a monologue, talks about how the Romans had celebrated their the generals or whatever who came back from wars, and that he quotes he quotes somebody from old Rome saying, well, then somebody whispers into the ear of one of these generals that all what is he saying? All glory is fleeting, right? So you end on that line in a movie, right? It's great stuff. I mean, movie writing wise, it's great stuff. So I think, you can walk out of a screening and say, okay, yeah, that's true. It's nothing changed. Nothing stays the same.
Great. We have some questions from the audience. We have one. What happened to the author in his later years or his final years?
Ladislas Farrago became somebody really. I mean, of course, as we know now that in the 50s he was already an interesting, colorful man, but the Patton book made him a very sought after writer. But he also made a ton of money, and he lived well. He lived in different places. If I'm not mistaken, he actually also lived in New Milford at one point. But I've been to the apartment that his son lives in now, which is rent control, and that's all from the old days of rent control in New York. A pretty nice place to live. So he died in the early 80s. I would have to look up the year.
Yeah, 1980. October 15th, 1980.
Thank you. And in my book, that would be actually not the 80s, because I'm a anal person with that. To me, that's at the 70s, the last year of the 70s. But never mind. He still worked on Patton. He started the book, The Last Days of Patton. He couldn't finish this. He died. His son helped to finish the book. It was published. And this book was turned into a TV movie called The Last Days of Patton. And now you have to guess who played Patton in the TV movie. Unless you know, then you don't need to guess. George C. Scott, in the 85 version, an actor who had aged quite a bit. I mean, he probably was now closer to Patton's age when he died. Patton was 60 years old when he died. But George C. Scott got another bite at this role that he had played, which is fascinating. The TV movie was not all that successful, but you can find it. I think Amazon Prime or something has it. So Ladislas Farrago, other than now he seems to be forgotten. He was in the business of uncovering things, including the Bormann story, which basically blew up in his face.
Someone wonders if you've been in touch with George C. Scott's son, Campbell Scott, who lives here in Sharon.
I once have, in the early going, I tried to get in touch with him because I knew there was another Sharon connection. But in a way, the fact that he is the son of a famous, successful actor, and that he's an actor himself, and that he's in Sharon. These are, not these are connections, or these are points of interest. But I would almost think that, it would be interesting to hear him on things like what he thinks about the performance of his father. But when it comes to the making of the movie and the writing of the book and all of these things, he's probably not all well versed. So maybe there will be a chance to talk to him at some point. It would be lovely, because we're all, here in Sharon, we all like to talk to each other. So
I did reach out to him, and he sent me a very nice email, and he said that he was 8 years old when the movie came out, and he doesn't have a lot of specific memories about it, but that as an actor he really respected and admires his father's performance. But he says his father never talked about it, and I guess he never really talked about refusing the Oscar. There's a little
hardly
clip.
ever, yeah.
There's a little
Yeah.
clip on the second disc of this set, in the documentary Making the Movie, where you hear George C. Scott's voice saying, he believed it took away from the art of an actor, and that he
Yeah.
should be separate from the performance should stand on its own, and he didn't want to draw attention to himself. That he, but I'm sure he may have some opinions about it. Tom, did you have a comment?
Maybe you just answered my question, which was, do we know why he refused to accept the Oscar? Was that it? What you just said about he didn't want to draw attention to himself as opposed to the art?
Well, he had, there was a television interview he gave at one point after all of this. He was very consequential in that. I mean, he had hinted at when he was considered, or some years before, considered for supporting actors Oscars, that he didn't want this. So it was not like, for the people behind the scene, was not a big shock that here's somebody who is so self-confident about his work that and that he doesn't like the show part of it, the marketing part of it. But in this interview, he explains that he thinks that the Oscars is basically part of something that has nothing to do with the art of acting or movie making. It's a commercial. It's part of the commercial world, part of the marketing, and it turns an actor and his work into what he said, a thing. So you're no longer a person in this world. You're somebody else, and the media, including people like me, and the movie industry, they're basically not nice to respect the craft. And so it's an unusual take, and maybe we want to know a little bit more about it. But I find it plausible if you have the courage to stand up and say these things. I find it plausible.
Okay.
Another question: have you come across any interviews where people commented on how George C. Scott felt about his the process of portraying Patton, and what that was like?
Well, we know a few things about how he had a difficult way of getting to the results. I mean, I think it's known that he suffered from alcoholism at least at some point. So he struggled with his work, but everybody who worked with him was then saying, well, but when the time came, when the camera was rolling, he was on. And so, for instance, this speech that we showed earlier, there were quite interesting questions, artistic questions about this. I don't know if you notice this. So the Patton in uniform is a 4-star general at the end of the war, with all the things, the medals and everything on it. There's only one historic photo of the real Patton that actually happened in 1945 after the war. And George C. Scott argued that was not a way to start the movie, even though Francis Ford Coppola had written it that way. And they had to trick him to find a way to record it. And then, in the editing process, put it where it was supposed to go. But the people who saw what he did when the speech was on, it's one take. So it's not like, this guy is suffering from expressing his view or his take on the general. He's in, almost in the method acting tradition. I mean, he is Patton, and he stays in that role for the time of these 70 days or so of the production. He is Patton, and you can ask him basically on any given day, in the end or in the beginning, hey, we need this now, and he gives it to you. So people like us who don't know much about the story behind the story, we still, we love it because it's authentic, so plausible. But he was on, as Patton IV said, he got it. And then the family connection between him and between Scott and the family is also fascinating, because George C. Scott at one point shows up in Fort Knox after the movie and stuff is done, and the Patton son is in Fort Knox. That's where he's stationed, and his wife Joanne. And so George C. Scott comes to visit, and Joanne told me about how this all then played out. And she says, well, she was expecting maybe that somebody comes to the front door and has a bouquet of flowers or something, like you're visiting somebody and a woman, So George C. Scott didn't have a bouquet of flowers. He had a box with him, a large box. And first they had no idea what was in the box. Well, George C. Scott got one set of celluloid copies in these tin cans, and these tin cans in a box. So George C. Scott brought the celluloid version of the movie to the family that had basically rejected that there was ever a movie. And so from then on, they really kind of, they did well. And I'm amazed by how these little things, turn things around. Just as interesting, by the way, I went to West Point for my research and talked to the head historian there, who's a colonel. And he only became an officer or went to West Point because he loved the movie so much. He only got to West Point because of the movie. That's, something.
It's impressive.
Wow. We have a question here, a more personal question for you. Do you feel you were successful in researching your own history? How far could you get, or were many documents classified or missing that might have helped you?
I have to interpret the question when my personal history is, my family's history. Is that what is implied in the question? Or
Barbara, is that right? Yes.
Okay. So the war, mainly the second part of the last part of the war, which was quite a bit of destruction in Germany in so many different ways. You don't have all the records that you would love to have. So I had some going back. I guess the most important one is, did your family members play any role in what the Nazis did? And so my mother was 16 by the end of the war. My father became a soldier by the age of 17, and he was captured after 2 weeks of service in northern Italy by the Americans. He became 18 years old on the boat over to prisoner of war camp in the United States. So, other than being part of a system, you can't really pinpoint anything different from a colleague of mine from the same town that I grew up in, who just revealed the story of his grandfather, who was an important part of annihilation of killing Jews in Eastern Europe. And he just wrote about the story, how he found out and how well this is documented, but the family never wanted to talk about. So in my case, and my grandparents were, not involved in any of this. My one grandfather was dead already. He was a miner, and he died in the mines. And the other one had served in World War I, but not later on. So, and before that, it gets a little murky because of lack of papers and things like that. There's a way to substantiate at least, a family, maybe beginning of the end of 18th century, but I doubt it. It's hard to say.
Are there any other questions for Jürgen about any of this? There's so many threads to explore, so many parts of the story.
Yeah, Gretchen, I would just ask a quick question about your sense from the house. Are there, once you found out who the earlier owner was, did you see, is there any sense of connection or signs or anything that he had left behind that made you more interested in Farrago as a writer or as a historic figure?
Well, if I wouldn't have had this one, incident where somebody tells me about a former, a person who formerly lived in the house, I would have no idea. There is probably no record. He was a renter. He did not have to pay taxes. So if you go to the Sharon town offices, you will probably not find anything about him.
Yeah.
And so the lucky circumstance was really, part one, to have somebody talk about it, and part two, somebody still around to give you some background information so that you have at least an idea. This is a real man who lived here and he produced something of value. And then from then on, you basically start thinking, okay, I wrote all of my books in this house. So in a way, you feel, is there something in the water, or is it the view, or what makes us, this small cadre of people, what makes us want to be creative in this house? But that's already stupid because there's other houses right around here with other creative people. So I'm not claiming that this is the place. I don't want this to become a place that people want to visit to see, how the sausage is made around here. I mean, that's not so fascinating. But in a way, and I see, our current first selectman is very interested in unearthing elements, and the Historical Society is doing this also. So what I like about it is this is a contribution to a larger bouquet of stories, of personalities, and that show, yeah, this is a small town and it's somewhere out there in the boonies, but it has its qualities, it has its characters, it has its personalities, and it will go on if we all share in the same vein. I mean, if we all love to be creative, if we all keep on communicating with each other, if we all keep the library going as a place to come together and share these stories, right? Then, imagine, I mean, I mentioned that in passing, Johannes Buchmann, who was living in Ellsworth, and how I met him at a library event. People who know Sharon Library or Hotchkiss Library of Sharon know that there is a fundraising event where authors come and sign books. And so Johannes Buchmann was there at an event, I think 2009, when Michael Korda, the writer, presented his book about a World War II story, which was the Michael Korda book was, this is the cover of the German book that I wrote with Johannes Buchmann. The Michael Korda book was about the Battle of Britain, if I'm correct. And so Johannes Buchmann, in his, I have an accent, but he had a much stronger accent. He talked to Michael Korda about his ideas and how his World War II experience. And I was, it just so happened I was standing there and I heard that conversation. And then I asked this gentleman in German, okay, what's going on? And so over a little, I don't know, several months or so, we started to figuring out that his story could be a book. And then we turned it into a book, which was published in 2010, I think. That's the library. You can't blame anybody else. Blame the library.
I will add that's not the only case of somebody meeting somebody at the book signing and then going on to publish a book or work on a book together to collaborate. Particularly children's book authors and illustrators have met mentors there that have mentored them. were even mentioned in one of Danny Shapiro's memoirs, about how she didn't want to come to the book signing, how she hated things like this, but her publisher was sending her, and it changed her life because she was seated next to somebody from Kripalu, a well-known Buddhist writer who then became her mentor, and they're very close friends. So there have been lots of connections like that made at the book signing, which is really quite wonderful. So I don't see any more questions, but we have a comment from someone suggesting that we share in a round of Zoom applause for Jürgen.
Thank you.
We can do that.
Thank you very much.
And
Very kind of you. And I see we had a few people today. You know, on a Sunday, people can do other things, you know.
Yeah.
So glad you found the time and the interest. So
thank you so much, Jürgen. It was fascinating. Thank you all for sharing the afternoon with us and being here. Maybe we have all been inspired to go do a little research about our own homes and people we've known. I have a strange little connection in my house I've always wanted to explore. So maybe now I will be inspired to work on that.
Yeah.
And I bet there are lots of other stories. And I'll mention, you know, at the library, we recently opened a cabinet that has been locked for at least 50 or 60 years. And we discovered the remains of the original library in Sharon, which was called the Sharon Union Library, founded in 1802. It was housed at the Congregational Church, older than the existing Congregational Church. I don't know where it stood. And it was a library put together by John Cotton Smith, who was a governor of Connecticut, and Charles Sedgwick. And we found on top of the shelves a ledger from 1802 in the most amazing penmanship that lists the original books, 245 books that were purchased from a bookseller in New York with the cost. And it was a subscription library. And so then there's a list of people who bought a subscription to the library, and the rules of the library, which included was only available one day a month, and it was the third Tuesday of the month, and your books were due 2 hours before sunset. And if you were late, there was a very long list of rules of what the librarian was able to do. And there was even a superseding board to make decisions on what to do if you really messed up your books or lost the book. And the librarian had to defer to this superseding board to figure out what to do. But anyway, it's a really beautiful thing. It's now in the safekeeping of the Historical Society, and we're going to digitize it and hopefully put it on display so everyone can see it. So there are lots and lots of stories to explore in Sharon.
terrific. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Jürgen.